A boy was born into one of the most famous families in America, carrying the name of a father he would never once lay eyes on, raised behind guarded gates because someone had already tried to kidnap him before he could even walk. Decades later, this same man would stand at his own son's grave, burying a child taken from him far too soon, closing a circle of loss that had somehow followed this family since before he was even born. The king of Hollywood's final wish. Clark Gable had already lived several lifetimes by the time he reached his late 50s. Known throughout the world simply as the King of Hollywood, Gable had built an extraordinary film career spanning decades, becoming one of the most recognizable and beloved leading men in the history of American cinema, forever remembered for his role as Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind, a performance that earned him lasting cultural immortality and helped define an entire generation's understanding of screen romance and masculinity. But behind the glamour of the silver screen, Gable's personal life had been marked by considerable heartbreak. He had already been married 4 times by the late 1950s, and the third of those marriages, to actress Carole Lombard, had ended in devastating tragedy when Lombard died in a plane crash in January of 1942, a loss that friends said Gable never fully recovered from for the remainder of his life, one that reportedly led him to enlist in the United States Army Air Forces shortly afterward, seeking purpose and distraction amid his grief during the height of the Second World War, flying combat missions over Europe despite being well past the age when most men would have considered enlisting for active combat duty. In 1955, Gable married for the fifth and final time to a woman named Kay Williams, sometimes known by her earlier married name, Kay Spreckles. Kay had already been married and divorced 3 times herself before meeting Gable, and the two settled into a genuinely happy partnership on the actor's ranch property in Encino, California, a rare period of domestic stability for a man whose earlier marriages had each ended in either divorce or devastating loss. Kay also brought 2 children of her own from her earlier marriages into the household, and Gable, by most accounts, embraced the role of stepfather with genuine warmth, having reportedly longed for a family of his own for many years, despite the repeated setbacks his earlier romantic life had brought him. Friends and colleagues who observed the couple during these years often remarked on just how genuinely content Gable appeared during this final chapter of his personal life, a marked contrast to the more turbulent decades that had preceded it. By 1960, with Gable now approaching his 60th year, Kay became pregnant, and the news brought the aging star a level of joy that those close to him described as genuinely profound, a joy made all the more poignant given how many years had already passed since he had first become a father figure to his stepchildren from Kay's earlier marriages. Speaking to a reporter in 1960 while filming what would become his final movie, The Misfits, out in the Nevada desert, Gable spoke with evident excitement about the child on the way, describing the pregnancy as a wonderful gift arriving late in his life. He explained his plans to step away from filmmaking entirely once the production wrapped, intending to remain at home not simply for the birth itself, but for many months afterward, determined to be present for his child's earliest years in a way his demanding film career had rarely allowed him to be present for much else in his personal life. A commitment that stood in genuine contrast to the punishing shooting schedules and constant travel that had defined so much of his professional life across 3 decades in the industry. It was a rare and tender glimpse into the private hopes of a man the public had spent decades knowing only as a dashing, larger-than-life screen icon, a side of Gable that stood in sharp contrast to the confident, unshakable persona he had cultivated on screen for the better part of 3 decades. Tragically, fate had an entirely different plan in mind, one that would rob Gable of ever meeting the very child he had spoken about with such genuine anticipation. A birth his father never lived to see. In early November of 1960, while Kay was roughly 5 months into her pregnancy, Clark Gable suffered a serious heart attack. He was admitted to Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital, where doctors and family alike held on to hope that he might yet recover. For nearly 2 weeks, Gable remained hospitalized, and by most accounts, his condition appeared to be stabilizing, with reports at the time suggesting his physicians were cautiously optimistic about his eventual recovery and return home. Kay stayed close by his side throughout this period, and on the evening of November 16th, 1960, the two had shared dinner together inside his hospital room, with Kay reportedly settling into a nearby room across the hall to rest for the night, unaware that this quiet, ordinary evening together would be their very last. Later that same evening, Gable suffered a second fatal heart attack. According to the hospital administrator who addressed reporters afterward, Gable had appeared to be resting comfortably, sitting up in his bed, before simply lying his head back against the pillow. And that was the end. He was 59 years old. The news of his sudden death sent shockwaves through the entire world, marking the loss of one of the most beloved actors of the golden age of Hollywood, and it left his pregnant widow to face the coming months entirely without the husband who had so recently expressed such heartfelt excitement about becoming a father once again. A grief made all the more complicated by the fact that she now had to prepare, entirely alone, for the arrival of a child whose father would never have the chance to hold him. 4 months later, on March 20th, 1961, Kay gave birth to a son in Los Angeles, whom she named John Clark Gable, carrying forward his father's name into a new generation that Clark himself would never have the chance to know. It was an almost unbearably poignant beginning to a life, a child born into extraordinary fame and inheriting one of the most recognizable surnames in the entire history of American entertainment, yet never once given the opportunity to meet the very man whose name and legacy he now carried forward. In later years, John himself would describe the strange and profoundly difficult experience of growing up entirely without any personal memory of his father, a man the rest of the world felt they knew intimately through decades of films, yet a man John himself would only ever come to understand through old photographs, second-hand stories, and the flickering images preserved on movie screens, a peculiar kind of inheritance that few other children of famous parents have ever had to fully reckon with in quite the same way. It was a loss that would shape the entirety of John's childhood, one that his mother, in her own grief, would go on to handle with an almost extreme degree of protective secrecy. A childhood kept hidden from the world. Following Clark Gable's death, Kay chose to remain on the family's 22-acre ranch property in Encino, raising her infant son largely within its private, guarded grounds, a decision that offered both continuity and a measure of protection during an otherwise devastating period of transition for the young widow. It did not take long before that decision proved to be a wise and, in fact, genuinely necessary precaution. When John was still just an infant, roughly 1 year old, an attempt was made to kidnap him, a terrifying incident that permanently reshaped how Kay approached raising her son for the remainder of his childhood. From that point forward, John rarely appeared in public, and when he did, he was almost always accompanied by dedicated security personnel, a level of protection considerably beyond what most children, even those born into considerable wealth and fame, typically required, a precaution that Kay maintained consistently throughout John's entire childhood and adolescence. The result was a childhood defined almost entirely by seclusion. For nearly 2 decades, the broader public caught only the rarest glimpses of Clark Gable's only acknowledged son, occasional photographs appearing in magazines showing a young boy alongside his mother, but otherwise offering almost no insight into what his day-to-day life actually looked like behind the guarded gates of the family ranch, a level of privacy that stood in stark contrast to the way most celebrity children of that era were regularly paraded before the cameras at premieres, parties, and other public functions. One particularly notable image from April of 1961 showed the infant John alongside his mother on a magazine cover, a brief public introduction to the boy who carried such an enormous legacy on his shoulders before he was even old enough to understand what that legacy actually meant. Another photograph, taken in May of 1972 at the premiere of the film The Cowboys, showed an 11-year-old John standing beside his mother, one of the few documented public appearances from those largely hidden childhood years, a rare moment when the wider public was able to catch even a brief glimpse of how the boy had grown in the intervening decade. John himself later reflected on just how strange this experience had been. Describing the bizarre nature of growing up as a child, the entire world felt they somehow already knew, simply by virtue of his father's fame, even though John himself had absolutely no memories or personal connection to the man at all. A disconnect, he said, made it genuinely difficult, even well into adulthood, to fully process exactly who his father had actually been as a person, rather than simply as a cultural icon. It left him in an unusual and genuinely difficult position, carrying the weight of an enormous public legacy while privately possessing none of the actual relationship that legacy might have suggested to outside observers. A tension that shaped much of how he approached both his own public identity and his eventual career choices as he grew older. Yet even as John quietly grew up behind the protective walls of his family's Encino ranch, an entirely separate secret connected to his father's complicated romantic history remained buried, one involving a sister John did not even know existed, a secret that had been carefully guarded by two of Hollywood's biggest stars for decades before the full truth would eventually come to light. The half-sister he never knew existed. Long before John Clark Gable was ever born, his father had been involved in an entirely different, far more scandalous chapter of his personal life, one that Hollywood's own carefully managed publicity machine had worked for decades to keep hidden from public knowledge. In 1935, while filming the movie Call of the Wild on location in Washington state, Clark Gable, then 34 years old and already married to someone else at the time, began a relationship with his 22-year-old co-star, the rising actress Loretta Young. The affair proved brief, but it resulted in a pregnancy that placed Young, a devout Roman Catholic, deeply concerned about the potential scandal, in an extraordinarily difficult position, one made even more precarious by the very real possibility that her own studio might pressure her toward options she considered morally unacceptable given her deeply held religious convictions. Young made the decision to travel to Europe to wait out her pregnancy, away from the prying eyes of the Hollywood press, and upon returning to the United States, she quietly placed her newborn daughter into an orphanage rather than risk any public connection between herself and the child. The baby, born in November of 1935, spent the following 19 months moving between various hideaways and orphanages before Young finally brought her home, presenting the girl to the public and, remarkably, to the child herself as an adopted daughter rather than her own biological child. Young named her daughter Judy, and for years she went to extraordinary lengths to obscure any physical resemblance between the girl and her actual father, reportedly keeping Judy's distinctively large Gable-like ears hidden beneath hats and eventually arranging for the child to undergo corrective surgery on her ears at just 7 years old, specifically intended to quiet the persistent rumors already circulating throughout Hollywood about the girl's true parentage. Rumors that had apparently begun almost as soon as Judy was old enough for her facial features to start resembling those of her famous, unacknowledged father. Remarkably, Judy actually met her biological father once, as a 15-year-old, during a visit to her mother's Beverly Hills home, an encounter she would remember vividly for the remainder of her life. describing how Gable had spent time asking her about her ballet lessons and her schoolwork before kissing her gently on the forehead as he left, seemingly aware, even if unstated, of exactly who she truly was to him. A small but deeply meaningful gesture from a father who never once publicly acknowledged the connection between them during his own lifetime. A moment Judy would later describe in her memoir as one of the most vivid and precious memories from her entire childhood, despite the layers of secrecy still surrounding it at the time. Yet Judy herself remained completely unaware of the true nature of that encounter for years afterward, only growing suspicious of her actual parentage as she approached adulthood, when persistent whispers and half-understood comments from those around her gradually began suggesting a truth her mother had spent decades working so carefully to conceal. It would take a confrontation on Labor Day weekend of 1966, years after Clark Gable's own death, before Loretta Young finally admitted the truth directly to her daughter, confirming what Hollywood insiders had quietly suspected for decades, that Judy was not adopted at all, but was in fact the biological daughter of Clark Gable himself. A secret that took decades to fully surface. Even after learning the truth from her mother directly in 1966, Judy Lewis, as she was known by that point following her own marriage, chose to keep the full details of her extraordinary parentage private for nearly 3 more decades, confiding only in a small circle of close friends and family members, while allowing the wider public to continue believing the carefully constructed fiction her mother had maintained for so long. It was not until 1994, when Judy published her own memoir titled Uncommon Knowledge, that the broader American public finally learned the complete truth about one of Hollywood's most carefully guarded secrets, a revelation that instantly reframed decades of quiet rumor and speculation into confirmed historical fact. In her memoir, Judy described in painful detail the psychological toll of growing up never fully accepted or acknowledged by her own mother, describing how difficult it had been as a young girl to sense that something essential about her own identity was being deliberately withheld from her, a feeling she said had shaped much of her own sense of self well into her adult years. The publication of that memoir came at a genuine cost to Judy's relationship with her mother. Loretta Young, by that point in her final years, reportedly refused to speak with her daughter for 3 full years following the book's release, unable or unwilling to forgive Judy for finally making public a truth she herself had spent nearly 6 decades working so carefully to suppress, a rift that caused Judy considerable personal pain, even as she maintained that sharing her own story had been an essential act of reclaiming her own identity after so many years of enforced silence. It was only shortly before Loretta's own death in August of 2000 that any meaningful reconciliation between mother and daughter appears to have occurred, closing out one of the most quietly heartbreaking family sagas connected to Hollywood's golden age, one that had remained hidden from the public for the better part of 6 decades before finally coming fully into the light. For John Clark Gable, the existence of this half-sister added yet another genuinely complicated layer to his own already unusual family history. Here was a woman, roughly 25 years his senior, sharing the same famous father, who had spent her own entire childhood similarly denied any open acknowledgement of exactly who she truly was, just as John himself had spent his own childhood denied any actual personal relationship with that same father, 2 siblings separated by decades and by entirely different circumstances, yet united by the same fundamental experience of growing up in the shadow of a father. Neither of them ever truly had the chance to know in any ordinary sense. Judy Lewis would go on to build a genuine career of her own as an actress, appearing in popular soap operas including The Secret Storm and General Hospital, before later pursuing formal training in psychology and eventually working as a psychotherapist, specializing in adolescent counseling. Work that colleagues suggested traced back directly to her own painful experience of hidden identity during her own childhood years. Judy passed away on November 25, 2011, at the age of 76, following a battle with lymphoma, leaving behind a genuinely remarkable and painful story that stood as its own quiet parallel to John's own complicated inheritance as Clark Gable's only publicly acknowledged son. Even as this family history slowly came into fuller public view, John himself was already well into building an adult life and identity entirely his own, one that would eventually carry him toward two very different passions, acting and motorsports, along with challenges of his own that the public would only partially glimpse over the following decades. Racing toward his own identity. As John Clark Gable grew into adulthood, he found himself navigating the unusual challenge of carrying one of the most recognizable surnames in American entertainment history, while having virtually no personal relationship to the father whose fame that name represented. Rather than immediately pursuing acting, the field so closely associated with his father's own legendary career, John instead developed a genuine and lasting passion for off-road racing, competing professionally in demanding events, including the Baja 500 and Baja 1000. Grueling desert races that tested both driver and vehicle across hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain, requiring both physical endurance and mechanical expertise that had nothing whatsoever to do with the glamorous world of film his father had once dominated so completely. It was a pursuit entirely separate from his father's own legacy, one that allowed John to build a reputation and an identity rooted in his own individual skill and determination, rather than in any inherited fame. A deliberate choice, friends suggested, that reflected John's own desire to prove his worth on terms that had nothing to do with his famous last name. John did eventually step into acting as well, making his feature film debut in the 1990 Western Bad Jim, appearing alongside veteran actors James Brolin and Richard Roundtree, playing a character named John T. Coleman in a production that offered him his first genuine opportunity to test himself within the very industry his father had once so thoroughly dominated. A full 3 decades after his father's own death had first placed the Gable name at the very center of Hollywood mourning. While the film did not achieve significant commercial success, it marked a genuine, if modest, entry point into the same industry that had once made his father one of the most famous men in the entire world, and it gave John a small taste of the profession that had defined so much of his family's public identity, even though he himself had grown up almost entirely outside of it. John continued taking on various acting roles over the following decades, including later appearances in smaller independent productions, though his career in front of the camera never approached anything close to the towering scale of his father's own legendary status, a reality that seemed to suit John reasonably well, given how much of his adult identity remained rooted instead in his ongoing passion for competitive racing. John's adult life was not without its own share of genuine difficulty and public scrutiny. In 2013, he was arrested in Malibu on charges connected to driving under the influence of alcohol, an incident that reportedly involved his vehicle striking several parked cars before he was taken into custody by Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies, an episode that drew renewed media attention, specifically because of his famous last name, even though the incident itself involved nothing more unusual than the kind of legal trouble that touches countless ordinary people across the country each year. It was a difficult and very public stumble for a man who had spent much of his life trying to carve out a private, independent identity beyond the shadow of his famous father's legacy. A reminder that even someone who had worked so hard to build his own separate path in life remained, in the eyes of the media, permanently and inescapably connected to one of the most famous names in American entertainment history. Yet even as John continued building his own career and navigating his own personal struggles, he was also, during these same years, building a family of his own, one that would eventually include a son whose own life and career would come to mirror in painfully tragic ways. Some of the very same themes of fame, identity, and premature loss that had already defined so much of the Gable family's complicated history. Building a family and a son who followed him into the spotlight. Over the course of his adult life, John Clark Gable married 3 separate times. His first marriage, to a woman named Tracy Yarrow, took place in 1985 and would prove to be the only one of his 3 marriages to produce children. The couple welcomed a daughter, Kaylee Gable, born in 1986, followed 2 years later by a son, born on September 20th, 1988, whom they named Clark James Gable, carrying the family's famous name forward into yet another generation. A decision that reflected the same continuing pride in the Gable legacy that had shaped so much of John's own upbringing. Despite everything that legacy had cost him personally in terms of never actually knowing the man it originated from, John and Tracy's marriage eventually ended, and John went on to marry a second time, to a woman named Alexandria Remlin, a union that lasted from 1999 to 2002. Decades later, in September of 2020, John married for a third time, to a woman named Deborah Hartzell, a marriage that has continued in the years since, offering him, in his later years, a measure of the same kind of stability his own father had briefly found late in his own life with Kay Williams, decades earlier. Of his 2 children, it was his son, often known professionally as Clark Gable III, who would go on to build the most publicly visible career of the family's 3rd generation. Clark James Gable pursued work as an actor, model, and television presenter, eventually finding his most widely recognized role as a host of the reality television series Cheaters, a program built around confronting individuals suspected of being unfaithful to their romantic partners, a role that brought him a considerable degree of independent public recognition entirely separate from his family's storied Hollywood history. Beyond his television work, Clark James also ventured into entrepreneurship, at one point running his own men's fashion boutique, demonstrating the same kind of independent, multifaceted ambition that had characterized his own father's approach to building a career and identity separate from the towering legacy of his famous grandfather, a pattern of reinvention that seemed to run consistently through at least 3 generations of Gable men. Clark James went on to have a daughter of his own, named Shaw LaRae Gable, born on September 6th, 2017, extending the Gable family line into a 4th generation and making John Clark Gable a grandfather, decades after he himself had grown up without ever having the chance to know his own father. For a time, it seemed as though this next chapter of the Gable family's story might finally break free from the pattern of loss and complicated family history that had shadowed the family since Clark Gable's own sudden death back in 1960, with a young father building his own career, raising his own daughter, and preparing for what appeared to be a genuinely promising future ahead of him. That hope, however, would prove tragically short-lived, as the family's story took yet another devastating turn in the winter of 2019, one that would place John Clark Gable directly at the center of a parent's most unbearable nightmare. The day tragedy struck his own son. On the morning of February 22nd, 2019, Clark James Gable was found unresponsive in his bed inside his Dallas, Texas home by his fiancée, Summer, who had woken to discover something was seriously wrong. He was rushed to Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital in Dallas, but efforts to save him proved unsuccessful, and he was pronounced dead that same day at just 30 years old. According to the official findings released by the Dallas County Medical Examiner, Clark James had died from an accidental overdose involving a combination of illicit fentanyl, oxycodone, and alprazolam, a devastating and increasingly common tragedy connected to the broader opioid crisis that has claimed countless lives across the entire country in recent years, one that has touched families from every conceivable background and level of wealth or fame. The loss was a genuinely devastating one for the entire extended Gable family, striking John Clark Gable with a particular and almost unbearable cruelty. Here was a man who had grown up never having the opportunity to know his own father, who had spent decades building his own separate identity and eventually his own family, only to find himself, in his late 50s, burying his only son far too soon. A loss that echoed, in its own tragic way, the very kind of sudden, premature death that had already defined so much of his own family's complicated history, dating all the way back to his father's unexpected passing in 1960 and Carol Lombard's own devastating plane crash nearly 2 decades before that. A family whose entire story, across nearly a century now, had somehow always seemed to circle back to loss arriving far earlier than it ever should have. Clark James left behind not only his young daughter, Shaw, but also a fiancé and an extended family still processing the shock of losing someone so young and, by all accounts, someone who had genuinely seemed to be building a full and promising life for himself, one that included both his television career and his role as a father, a young man whose own public persona on Cheaters had ironically centered around confronting betrayal and dishonesty in other people's relationships, even as his own private struggles remained largely hidden from the public eye until his sudden and shocking death brought them fully into view. A painful irony that friends and colleagues who had worked alongside him on the show later found genuinely difficult to reconcile with the young man they thought they had known. His death served as a painful and very public reminder of just how devastating the ongoing opioid crisis had become across the entire country, capable of touching families regardless of their wealth, fame, or public prominence. A tragedy that placed the Gable name once again at the center of headlines, though this time for reasons that had nothing to do with Hollywood glamour and everything to do with the same kind of preventable, heartbreaking loss touching countless ordinary American families during that same period. Where John Clark Gable stands today. In the years since losing his son, John Clark Gable has continued living a life largely centered around his ongoing passions for both acting and motorsports, achieving genuine recognition within the off-road racing community, including securing multiple championship titles across his competitive career in the Lucas Oil Off-Road Racing Series, a testament to the same discipline and determination he had brought to the sport since first discovering his passion for it decades earlier. Now in his mid-60s, John remains one of the relatively few living direct links to one of the most celebrated and enduring legacies in the entire history of American cinema, a legacy he has carried for his entire life without ever once having the chance to personally know the man responsible for creating it. John's own reflections on his unusual life circumstances have occasionally surfaced in interviews over the years, offering rare glimpses into just how strange it has felt for him to exist as a kind of living connection to a father the rest of the world felt they knew intimately through decades of beloved films, while John himself possessed no actual memories or personal relationship to draw upon at all. He has described, in international interviews over the years, just how bizarre an experience it has been to have the entire world feel a sense of familiarity with a man John himself never had the chance to know in any personal capacity whatsoever. A strange inversion of the usual relationship between a famous parent and their children, one where the child was left to reconstruct an entire relationship secondhand, through films, photographs, and the recollections of others who had actually known his father personally, piecing together a portrait of a man he could never truly meet from fragments left behind by strangers, colleagues, and the flickering images of a career that had ended before John's own life had even properly begun. It is a particular and genuinely unusual form of inherited fame, one built entirely on absence rather than any actual lived relationship a burden that few people outside of similarly unusual family circumstances could ever fully understand or relate to in quite the same way. Today, John continues to maintain homes in both Santa Barbara and Malibu, California, remaining connected to the Southern California world, where his own extraordinary family story first began decades earlier, a region deeply tied to both his father's original film career and his own family's subsequent generations. His daughter Kaylee has followed her own father and her legendary grandfather into the entertainment industry, building an acting career of her own that has included appearances in various film and television projects over the years, including credits in productions such as Winchell, The Cynical Life of Harper Hall, and Sunset Society, ensuring that the Gable family's connection to American entertainment continues forward into yet another generation, even as the family continues quietly carrying forward the weight of profound loss that has touched nearly every chapter of its now nearly century-long history. Between Kaylee's own acting work and the enduring popularity of her grandfather's classic films, still screened and studied by new generations of film enthusiasts nearly a century after his rise to stardom, the Gable name remains a genuinely active and living part of American entertainment culture, rather than simply a historical relic confined to classic film retrospectives. A family legacy built as much on absence as on fame. Looking back across the full arc of this extraordinary family's story, what emerges is a history considerably more complicated and considerably more human than the glamorous Hollywood legend most people associate with the Gable name. Clark Gable himself, one of the most celebrated actors in the entire history of American cinema, left behind two children who each, in their own profoundly different ways, grew up without ever truly knowing him, one hidden away for decades as a supposed adopted child rather than his acknowledged biological daughter, and the other born into the world 4 months after his father had already passed away entirely. Both Judy Lewis and John Clark Gable spent their respective childhoods carrying an enormous inherited legacy, while simultaneously being denied the most basic thing most children take entirely for granted: an actual, lived relationship with their own father, a shared inheritance of absence that connected two siblings who otherwise led almost entirely separate lives across nearly the entire 20th century. For John specifically, that absence was compounded by genuine danger in his infancy, by decades of enforced privacy and seclusion, and eventually, in his own adult life, by the almost unbearable experience of burying his own son far too soon, a loss that echoed the same themes of premature, unexpected death that had already touched his family across multiple earlier generations, from Carol Lombard's fatal plane crash to his own father's sudden heart attack to his son, Clark James's tragic and preventable overdose decades later. A pattern of loss so consistent across nearly a century of family history that it becomes almost impossible to view any single tragedy in complete isolation from all the others that preceded it. What remains today is the story of a family whose public legacy has always been defined by the glamour and permanence of classic Hollywood cinema, yet whose private history reveals something far more fragile and far more painfully human: a pattern of loss, secrecy, and absence that has followed the Gable name for nearly a century, largely hidden from the very public that has spent generations celebrating the King of Hollywood's enduring on-screen legacy, a legacy built, in ways few fans ever fully realized, on a foundation of quiet, private grief that stretched across 4 full generations of the very same family. From a secret daughter raised as someone else's child, to a son born after his father's death, to a grandson lost decades later to an entirely different kind of tragedy, the true story of the Gable bloodline has always run considerably deeper and considerably sadder than the polished Hollywood mythology that carries the family's name forward into each new generation of film fans. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.